There are not many paintings that capture an artist's friends gathered together simply for the purpose of having a good time. Renoir's Luncheon of the Boating Party, painted in 1880 to 1881, is certainly the most famous. But Cape Ann has its own spirited snapshot of an age. It's called New England Ladies, painted in 1925 by Teresa Bernstein. All friends of Bernstein's, the people in this work together represent an important community of women in the Folly Cove neighborhood of Gloucester in the early 20th century. Teresa Bernstein came to Folly Cove at the invitation of artists Ellen Day Hale and Gabrielle DeVoe Clemens, who were considered life partners. Cape Ann historian Barbara Ercola described Miss Hale as a leader in Folly Cove's art colony, which was composed mostly of women like herself who had stuck to their own guns and studied art, despite family traditions of becoming decorative hostesses while men achieved their own goals. Ellen Day Hale's self-portrait hangs in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. Gabrielle DeVoe Clemens studied painting under Thomas Eakins and etching under Stephen Parrish. She was known in art circles throughout the country as a printmaker and muralist. Clemens is credited with being the first artist to find beauty in a granite quarry. Lillian Westcott Hale was considered one of the most successful Impressionist artists from the Boston School. She was known for portraying idealized, thoughtful women, but also sensitive impressions of the women in her own family, like this portrait of the artist's mother. Lillian was married to Ellen Day Hale's brother. Lillian's daughter, Nancy Hale, would become the most prolific fiction writer in the New Yorker magazine's history. She would receive the O. Henry Prize for Short Fiction 10 times. She was known for her portrayals of complicated women. Here is Nancy Hale, featured in a 1936 issue of Harper's Bazaar. Dorothy Grafley would become a prominent Philadelphia art critic and correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor and American Art magazine. She grew up in Paris. Her first playmate was Alexander Calder. Gertrude Stanwood studied painting with Miss Hale and Miss Clemens. The party is in her house. Mrs. Frisbee served meals in her own home across the street to Folly Cove visitors. There were sometimes 10 artists, including 2 future Prix de Rome recipients at her table. Mr. Burnham provided everyone with lobsters. Teresa Bernstein and her husband, artist William Meyerowitz, would for the rest of their lives divide their time between New York City and Cape Ann, capturing the social realities of urban America and Cape Ann in a changing century. Bernstein died in 2002 at what is thought to be 111 years. Nancy Hale would inherit her Aunt Nellie's, Ellen Day Hale's, Folly Cove Stone Studio, which so many of these friends, including Bernstein, had shared as creative space. Years later, Nancy reflected in a New Yorker piece on this group of artists, saying, "Once or twice, to my astonishment, I burst into tears. What astonished me was not so much that I should be crying, as what I realized I was crying about. It was not because my mother or Aunt Nellie was dead, or out of sadness for all those other artists, Aunt Nellie's friends, who also used this place long ago, but because in the silence of the studio, I remembered what a wonderful time they all had." Bernstein's painting testifies to that joy. And here's a last thought about this work by Teresa Bernstein. Duncan Phillips, founder of the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C., purchased Renoir's Luncheon of the Boating Party in 1923. In December of that year, Bernstein attended an opening in Washington, D.C. at the Corcoran Gallery, where her painting, Girlhood, painted, by the way, in Ellen Day Hale's Stone Studio, was being exhibited. During that visit, Duncan Phillips purchased Bernstein's Girlhood for the Phillips collection. No one can know for certain, but it seems likely that Bernstein saw the new Renoir at the Phillips on that visit. The very next year, 1925, Bernstein painted New England Ladies, this joyous assembly of her own Folly Cove friends, older and younger guests bridging the past and future. Could she have been thinking about the vivacity in the Renoir when she composed this gathering of her own special friends? Anna Coleman Ladd created neoclassical sculptures that added grace and gravitas to some of the grandest estate gardens and institutions across America and Europe. And yet, in her early 40s, Anna Coleman Ladd did something radically courageous and humane. She went to France and employed her sculptor's knowledge of the human form to mask the horrifically disfigured faces of men who had fought in World War I. On this new battlefield, trench warfare meant tens of thousands of soldiers would suffer extreme facial trauma. Advances in surgery and medicine meant they would survive it. Born in 1878 in Philadelphia, Anna Coleman Ladd studied art in Europe. Photographs portray her as a beautifully fashioned young woman with impudence, a sense of humor. A friend described her as plucky. Pictures consistently reveal an open and guileless spirit. In 1905, the artist married pediatrician Maynard Ladd. The couple eventually moved into a large home on Clarendon Street in Boston and, with their 2 daughters, into a summer home on Smith's Point in Manchester by the Sea, Massachusetts, where Ladd kept a studio. Ladd was dedicated to the neoclassical ideals of serenity, clarity, and classicizing modern subjects, particularly women and children. Many of the people who commissioned Ladd's sculptures were good friends from her wealthy social circle, including the famous Boston collector Isabella Stewart Gardner. Today, every day, hundreds of people pass by Ladd's sculpture of 2 young children captured in an eternal moment of happy play in Boston's public garden. In 1917, as the war advanced, Ladd's husband was assigned Deputy Commissioner of the Children's Bureau of the American Red Cross in France. Meanwhile, Ladd was learning through an art critic friend of the work of a London sculptor, Francis Derwent Wood, who was creating prosthetic faces for injured London soldiers. Ladd soon convinced the War Department to allow her to create a studio in Paris, financed with her own money, that would become the American Red Cross Studio for Portrait Masks. So many young men were, even after multiple surgeries, considered too grotesque to re-enter common life. On the most practical terms, these men needed jobs to support themselves and their families, and they needed masks to protect the world from what war had done to them. As Ladd reported, people can get used to seeing arms and legs missing, but they never get used to an abnormal face. Remarkably, this footage exists of Ladd walking into her studio and then working inside. Following Wood's lessons, Ladd worked from a plaster cast of the wounded soldier's face and from pre-war photographs of him. She would make a final plaster cast and then shape a very light copper mask with exquisite detail from this. The mask was painted when fitted on the man to perfectly match his complexion. His own hair was added for eyebrows, eyelashes, and a mustache. The mask attached to the face with eyeglasses, light wire, or ribbons. Masks always included a slightly open mouth hole for drinking and smoking a cigarette. Ladd wanted the studio to be a cheerful sanctuary for these soldiers' dignity. Of this work, Ladd said, "We do not profess to heal. After the wounded man has been discharged from the hospital, we begin our treatment." Of course, the chief difficulty in making these masks is to accurately match both sides of the face and restore the features so that there will be nothing of the grotesque in the appearance of the covering. A mask that did not look like the individual as he was known to his relatives would be almost as bad as the disfigurement. Ladd's Paris studio created more than 67 masks and more in 5 other hospitals across France. She received the prestigious Légion d'honneur Croix de Chevalier and the Serbian Order of St. Sava for this work. The Red Cross reports hundreds of messages and testimonials from surgeons, soldiers, and families. One saying simply, "Thanks to you, the despairing rejoice. The damned return to hope. The gentle wives and mothers will again find the faces they wept for." Very few of the masks remain, as soldiers requested to be buried wearing them. In 1918, Ladd returned to the North Shore, where she created monuments. One, commissioned by Hamilton Wenham citizens for their community house, depicts the 21-year-old pilot, Samuel Pierce Mandel, whose plane crashed 6 days before armistice. Ladd created 2 monuments for the American Legion, one in Manchester by the Sea, depicting a cadaver caught in barbed wire, found today in the Rosedale Cemetery, and a second entitled The Cost of Victory in Beverly Farms. In spite of this profound work and her renown as an artist, Ladd and her husband struggled financially after the war. In this letter, Ladd pleads with the bank not to foreclose on that Clarendon Street home, saying, "I am an unemployed artist since 1932, trying desperately to get work." The Ladds moved to San Diego, California in 1936. Anna died in 1939 at the age of 61. At a plaza dinner for the American Women's Association Club in 1925, Ladd said these words about her art: "Sculptors, to be any good at all, have to touch all sides of life. They deal in material and in spirit. They must have the physical strength of a blacksmith, the skill of a carpenter, the precision of a dentist, the knowledge of anatomy and psychology of a physician. Not only this, but they must have training in archaeology, mythology, history, and architecture. For the relation of the part to the whole is of the most vital importance in sculpture. They must have the soul of a poet and the creative energy of a god." If this exhibition were held in Paris and the artist had some curious Gallic or Spanish name, it would create something of a sensation. It would touch the Gallic imagination as something new and different. These are lines from a 1935 Boston Globe art review covering an exhibition of paintings by the artist Emma Fordyce McCrae, then a 48-year-old woman from Park Avenue with a Gloucester summer home overlooking Stage Fort Park. McCrae's paintings have been described by critics as holding 2 things at once: a unique modernist abstraction and an early Renaissance essence. Her surfaces, laid on and scraped off layers of paint, demand that we think of old-world frescoes. McCrae's compositions, from a dogwood branch to a girl's portrait, lace meaning and structure together in ways that recall Japanese theories of design. Arthur Wesley Dow, who artists at the time revered, called it the rhythmic harmony of colored spaces. Born in 1887 in Vienna, Austria, raised in a wealthy New York suburb, Emma Fordyce McCrae was the only daughter of affluent parents. Her mother came from wealth and her father was a professor of dermatology at Columbia University. The family traveled extensively in Europe. Her father purchased land in Gloucester in 1916 and built the house on Old Salem Road, or Hermit Hill, that would thereafter be home to McCrae's summer artistic life. In 1910, a shadow did fall over the young Emma's apparently cloudless years. At age 23, she married an intern in her father's practice, Thomas McCrae. They had a daughter, Alice, right away, but the marriage barely lasted a year. It would be annulled in 1920, and McCrae would go on to marry Dr. Homer Swift in 1922. 1 year after that failed marriage in 1911, McCrae began classes at the Art Student League in New York City, and later at the New York School of Art. Her family wealth would situate McCrae easily in the living rooms of Gloucester's grand Eastern Point homes, where a portrait market flourished. But McCrae instead chose to paint among the more energetic and gritty Gloucester artists, like William Meyerowitz and her teacher John Sloan. They were all showing in the Gallery on the Moors, the first cooperative venue for Cape Ann artists. McCrae was also showing in New York and Boston. Prestigious institutions like the National Academy of Design, the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, and the Art Institute of Chicago began accepting her submissions. With her Gloucester colleague Teresa Bernstein, McCrae became a member of the Philadelphia 10, a group of women artists who exhibited together in defiance of the gender bias they were seeing in the art world. McCrae's emphasis on composition drew her away from the open ocean and towards the close architecture of Cape Ann's coves, particularly its northern, more prosaic coves. Hodgkins Cove, Lane's Cove, and Pigeon Cove was her favorite, a quiet working-class nook farthest away from busy Gloucester. No lighthouses, no cresting waves, no muscled rowers. McCrae's emphasis on composition, the angles of boat to pier, the vertical of ladders, the pattern of roofs, tells a felicitous story of these tiny inlets along Ipswich Bay built by granite and sea. Populated by people fishing or enjoying a day at the beach with work and families on their minds, not art. McCrae's work is hard to find. Most of it remains with her family. She didn't push the sale of her paintings in her lifetime because she lived extremely comfortably and could afford not to. She painted her subjects, flowers and women, loyal to her artistic vision, with deceptive spareness that belies a quiet tension. These are not simple paintings, although at first glance they seem it. On Cape Ann, she chose to paint the places her peers overlooked. In the intimacy of these coves and small-town life, McCrae seemed also to be admiring, maybe counter to her own life, the beauty and complexity of less. Helen Stein's portrait of the painter Marston Hartley hangs in the Cape Ann Museum, part of their permanent collection. Hartley, whose own work is represented in major museums, is considered one of the quintessentially American artists. This arresting painting delivers in spare lines the lonely human that was Hartley. Helen Stein was born in Odessa, Russia in 1896. She came to this country, to New York City, at the age of 2. In New York, she took art classes at the Art Student League and Cooper Union. She went to Paris in 1925 and steeped herself in the modern art movement there. She returned to the U.S. in 1927 and soon settled into the East Gloucester Art Colony, which in those years hosted great names in modern art like Hans Hofmann. But almost every account of Stein's life describe her not as an artist but a friend, Marsden Hartley's friend, perhaps one of his few friends. He was a famously difficult person, ever struggling with his work, his peers, and the secret of his homosexuality. The Cape Ann Museum describes Stein as playing an essential role in shaping the fabric of the East Gloucester and Rocky Neck art colony and promoting modern art in the area. Like other sources, the Cape Ann Museum biography concludes by saying she was a friend of Marsden Hartley. The Smithsonian Museum has no images of Stein or her works, but rather include in their archives her 10 years of letters back and forth to Marsden Hartley. In spite of the bold purity of her 20th century painting, we read about Stein in the Hartley margins. Hartley's biographer says of their relationship, Stein understood and liked Hartley and was willing to put up with his moods and his distaste for anyone he did not find interesting. They were together constantly. They walked on Wingersheek Beach, saw movies together, and often had meals at her place, gossiping about others among the Gloucester art colony, most of whom Hartley disapproved of. She enjoyed the banter and appreciated his loyalty to her, even if frequently it took the form of jealousy when she paid attention to other Gloucester artists who he did not like for one reason or another. Like so many women who are footnotes in famous men's lives, Stein, in fact, had a vivid and largely untold life apart from these reduced scenes. In 1942, in Stein's very public divorce from her husband, Ernest Thurn, who had started the Thurn School of Art on Rocky Neck, glimpses appeared of her past, very different from the fish houses and pitched easels of Rocky Neck. Stein told the court that in her years in Paris, this man, Sir Michael Croyer Keilberg, an English financier known as the Molasses King, had been her benefactor. The divorce was covered for days in the Boston Globe. In it, Stein testified that her paintings had made her the toast of Paris, and that Croyer Keilberg had commissioned the modernist architect Le Corbusier to build her an art studio, which later became the Japanese consulate. The Depression crushed Stein's European future. She said that Sir Michael purchased her East Gloucester home at 9 Marble Street, where she lived and painted until dying in 1964. The European millionaire also established a U.S. bank account for her, depositing $10,000 in it at first and continuing to send monthly checks of $125 and more. Stein's husband confessed to the court that he was drawn to her for this income, and because she said being married to a prominent artist like her would help his art school. We may know little about Stein except for those early years and her life proximal to Marsden Hartley, but her paintings, strong examples of the modernist tradition, have their own message. The lines in a Stein painting never waver. They may seem brutal or startling, but they never hesitate. The courage and sensitivity with which Stein's brush moved must have been a part of her. That courage and sensitivity must have been a part of her choice of Rocky Neck after Paris, of Sir Michael's monthly checks, of Marsden Hartley as a friend. If the Rocky Neck art colony were a galaxy, artist Mary McGarrity Shore would be a star glowing at its center, lightly touching everyone in this mid-20th century community of artists and thinkers on Cape Ann. But Mary Shore also had an extraordinary artistic friendship far beyond Cape Ann. The eldest of 8 children, Mary McGarrity was born in Philadelphia in 1912. Mary McGarrity studied at Cooper Union and the Chicago Art Institute, after which, married by then to John Shore, she settled in Gloucester, Massachusetts. The range of Shore's experiments with light, color, line, space, and materials confirm a powerfully intelligent eye, a lyrical touch, and an artist who never stopped believing that making art means asking questions. In 1947, Shore and friends helped transform the traditional Gloucester Society of Arts into the Cape Ann Society of Modern Artists. She exhibited her work with Albert Alcalay and Gordon Guterman, considered two of the greatest painters from this period on Cape Ann. Shore was close with poet Charles Olson, the sovereign chief of Gloucester's avant-garde. While he was away from Gloucester teaching, Olson wrote affectionate letters to Shore that reflect his respect for her as an artist and a friend. East Gloucester artists and neighbors Helen Stein and Nell Blaine were two of Shore's dearest confidants and colleagues. Gloucester's poet laureate Vincent Farini, also a local framer, created frames for Shore's works, and after Mary and John Shore divorced, for a very short time, Vincent Farini was married to Mary Shore. But there is an entirely separate and surprising dimension to Shore's personal life, which reflects in the sculptural assemblages she created with scavenged materials. Also summering in that East Gloucester neighborhood were artist friends Teresa Bernstein and William Meyerowitz, who spent their winters in New York City teaching and working. In the 1920s, sculptor Louise Nevelson, considered one of the most important artists of the 20th century, studied with Bernstein and Meyerowitz in New York. Nevelson later became famous for her large monochromatic constructions from scavenged materials. It is assumed that Shore met Nevelson, 12 years her senior, through these East Gloucester friends. Brian Shore, Mary Shore's son, remembers by the early 1950s helping his mother and Louise Nevelson scavenge for all kinds of driftwood and materials on Niles Beach. In her biography of Louise Nevelson, author Laurie Lyle says of the artist, she developed a lifelong friendship with a young painter named Mary Shore, who lived in Gloucester, Massachusetts, with her husband and 2 sons. Mary was a beachcomber, and every few months she loaded her station wagon with sea refuse and took it to Louise in New York. If the weather was good, the two might drive back to Gloucester together. Brian Shore remembers that Louise would set up a table with large baskets in their yard to sort all the beach scraps they had collected over days, imagining and choosing what would work best in her pieces. Shore introduced Charles Olson to Louise Nevelson. Lyle recounts a night in Gloucester with these three that ended with Olson attacking Nevelson for being famous. Nevelson walked out, refusing to ever see Olson again, and she did not, in spite of his written apology. Certainly, the Nevelson friendship supported Shore beyond Gloucester. In 1949, Mary Shore had a one-person show at the Norlist Gallery in New York City, where Nevelson also showed. The Norlist Gallery was founded by Jimmy Ernst, son of the surrealist painter Max Ernst. Jimmy Ernst was also secretary to Peggy Guggenheim. In 1947, a group of prominent national artists like Stuart Davis and Edward Hopper founded the Artists' Equity Association. The mission was to address business and economic issues that affected artists, such as providing health insurance. Shore's friend Louise Nevelson was president of the New York chapter. Mary Shore served as national director. You cannot look at this friendship without looking at Shore's and Nevelson's work. Certainly, the exchanges within the two women's friendship left unassailable marks on each other's pieces. Brian Shore remembers Nevelson telling him that parts of the wooden pieces he had found on Niles Beach are in the Museum of Modern Art. And certainly parts of Nevelson's friendship appear in Mary Shore's creations. They are more intimate and lyrical than Nevelson's, but they also refer to Nevelson's architecture, symbolism, and totem-like forms. But perhaps it is really the Gloucester Sea, the endless gifts the surf offered freely to these two artist friends that connects all. Barbara Swann's paintings come boldly at you, whether it's a subject's mournful expression or the fluidity of refracted forms. The color, the composition, and the figures in Swann's paintings assert themselves, sometimes with poignancy, and sometimes because they are artfully unsettling. Her works hang in the National Portrait Gallery, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, and the Art Institute of Chicago, to name a few. While seemingly very little about Barbara Swann aligns with the Cape Ann art community, she was perhaps the most Rockport of all Rockport artists. In a 1973 interview for the Smithsonian Archives of American Art, Swann explained that she was an only child and that she grew up in a household where there was no art, even though both her parents were natives of a famous art colony, Rockport, Massachusetts. Swann's father's family were Swedes who had immigrated to Rockport to work in the granite industry. Her grandfather, John Swann, was a well-known quarry foreman, working in what is now called Flat Ledge Quarry, but was then referred to as Swann's Quarry. Swann's mother's family crossed the Atlantic in the 17th century, settling in Pigeon Cove. That grandfather, Captain William David Knowlton, sailed a steamer, the William H. Moody, out of Pigeon Cove, delivering Rockport granite to building projects along the eastern seaboard. He was killed at 43 years old when a derrick fell on him. Barbara Swann once said, "When you consider the sea captain father on my mother's side and the granite industry foreman on my father's, this was good, worthy labor." Swann was born in 1922. After graduating from Wellesley to please her father, she studied art under the German expressionist Karl Zerb at Boston School of the Museum of Fine Arts. Her vision later evolved, but Swann's painting never lost the expressionistic freshness of those early years. She lived and painted in France at Sanary-sur-Mer from 1949 to 1951. She met her husband, Alan Fink, at that time in Paris. In 1961, married with 2 children by then, Swann was one of 21 women to be accepted into the first group of fellows at Radcliffe's Institute for Independent Studies. The institute was founded by Radcliffe president Polly Bunting, who believed that many American women who had stopped promising careers to have families faced what she called a climate of unexpectation. At Radcliffe, Swann became close friends with poets Anne Sexton and Maxine Kumin. She created a number of important portraits of her poet friends, including a drawing of Anne Sexton when she was visiting Swann in Rockport. The intense working friendship Swann shared with Sexton and Kumin drew her into extraordinary collaborations. Swann provided the cover drawing for Sexton's poetry collection, Live or Die, published in 1966. And she illustrated Kumin's Upcountry, Poems of New England, published in 1972. Both collections received the Pulitzer Prize. But perhaps the most provocative illustrations Swann created were for Sexton's book, Transformations, a hard-boiled retelling of Grimm's fairy tales in poetry. Swann connected instantly to Sexton's contemporary interpretations. As soon as she read the poem Snow White, a universal confrontation between aging beauty and young beauty, she called her friend to say, "My God, Anne, I love that poem. I identify with that poor old queen." As Swann reports, Anne then replied, "So do I." After multiple attempts, Sexton would take her life 2 years later. Swann's husband, Alan Fink, opened the Alpha Gallery in Boston in 1967. From its inception, the Alpha Gallery has exhibited emerging, mid-career, and established contemporary artists, as well as 20th century historical figures and modern masters.
Today, their daughter, Joanna Fink, runs the gallery. Swan's son, Aaron Fink, is also a painter. His works hang in the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the National Gallery of Art, among others. Across her artistic career, Swan remained a quiet steward for her family's Rockport heritage. Her home in Pigeon Cove, now owned by her children and theirs, is just a short walk from John Swan's quarry. Aaron Fink still paints in his mother's studio. Swan died in 2003 at age 80. Her mother, Clara Knowlton Swan, daughter of that Pigeon Cove ship captain, died 5 days before her daughter at the age of 106. Joanna Fink says they believe the mother intuitively just did not want to outlive her daughter. This is the story of someone who grew up one generation away from Rockport's most revered work, quarrying and shipping stone. Swan said her father never wanted her to be an artist. He believed the artist's lifestyle was antithetical to the kind of hard work his family had valued. Perhaps Swan's Rockport heritage and her art were not so much apart. Perhaps they have sustained each other all along as one. Art in the family tradition was Barbara Swan's good, worthy labor. Behind Nell Blaine's ravishing paintings of Gloucester Harbor and bouquets of flowers lies a surprising, even shocking, artistic and personal journey. Blaine was born in 1922 in Richmond, Virginia. She claimed she knew before she started school that she wanted to be an artist. Her father died when she was 16, and at 19, to her mother's fierce objections, Blaine went off to New York City. Abstraction charged the New York art world at the time, and Blaine desperately wanted to be part of it. At 20, she was studying with Hans Hofmann, the renowned expressionist painter and teacher. Abstraction consumed her, particularly the work of Mondrian. In a 1967 Archives of American Art interview, Blaine said of Mondrian, "What really interested me was basic vertical and horizontal relationships and the equilibrium, and then this very clean, fresh air that he seemed to have. I was really completely in love with Mondrian, the whole business." The jazz scene was as important to Blaine as painting then. Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie. She briefly married saxophonist Bob Bass. Rhythm was then and would remain critical to all her painting. Blaine was at the center of this new, vitalized culture. At 23, she had her first solo exhibition in New York City. The seminal modern art critic Clement Greenberg championed her. Peggy Guggenheim's art buyer, Howard Putzel, described her work as the hope of American painting. And she was the youngest member of the group called American Abstract Artists. Blaine admitted she was too abstract then even for Hans Hofmann. Also in 1943, Blaine and her husband made a first trip to Gloucester, Massachusetts. In spite of this radical success, Blaine knew she was missing a large piece of an artist's education. In 1950, at 28, divorced by then, Blaine made her first trip to Europe. On reflection, she said she was already starting to move away from abstraction, but Paris, the sheer beauty of it, completed this transformation. In the Archives interview, Blaine said this, "I began to feel the greatest pleasure in the world was to sit out on the banks of the Seine and draw those scenes. And I was just so taken with the visual, just the look of the city. It's the first beautiful city I had seen, and nature took over, and I realized I had been depriving myself of some wonderful, sensuous pleasure with painting. And I just kind of let go, and my painting changed completely in Paris. I was never so happy. I realized I closed the door to some part of painting." With that European trip, Blaine began the complete transition to figurative work, which would remain her essence. And she credits a later trip to Oaxaca, Mexico in 1957 for permanently intensifying the light and color in her paintings. Blaine joined what became called the second generation New York painters, who were responding to abstraction with a new figuration. Her new work was just as well received. She exhibited broadly, solo and group shows at the Tibor Donaghey Gallery, the Poindexter Gallery, and many others. Her friend group included poets and collaborators John Ashbery and Kenneth Cook. She had fellowships at the MacDowell and Yaddo art colonies. But in 1959, fate abruptly and dramatically took a swipe at her. On a successful painting trip to Greece on the island of Mykonos, Blaine contracted bulbar spinal polio. It is speculated she caught it from swimming in polluted water. Within days, she was being airlifted to an American military hospital and placed in an iron lung. Blaine would spend the rest of her life in a wheelchair, dependent on caregivers, particularly her partner, Carolyn Harris. With her right arm almost immobile, Blaine would relearn to paint with her left as dominant. But what is truly remarkable is that polio seemed to barely slow Blaine down. The very next year, the artist had 2 solo exhibitions and was included in 2 group shows. In that decade, she would travel extensively, work again at Yaddo, and spend more summers painting in Gloucester. According to her biographer, Martika Sawin, Blaine's life was actually one of confinement, dependence, pain, and anxiety. But her work remained meticulous, lush, and bold. Blaine would continue to say it all goes back to Mondrian, the push and pull of color and the energy created by that tension across a plane connects directly to Mondrian's squares. Blaine lived on Riverside Drive in New York City since her illness, but in 1974, at the age of 52, she received a Guggenheim Award and she purchased a summer home in Gloucester with a view of the harbor. Blaine would continue to travel and paint, particularly to Austria, where she inherited property from a friend, but it was difficult. She needed her subjects to come to her more often. In a way, flowers became for Blaine what bottles were to the artist Morandi. Accessible material to return to over and over again that never ceased to teach about the honesty of space. Table settings were accessible material which she often painted into the quiet of the night. As experimentations with pattern and the emotion of color, these works summon the interiors of the French painter Bonnard. As her wheelchair allowed, Blaine went down the hill from her home to the harbor. A subject which revealed to her, as her biographer says, light as energy. Nell Blaine died in 1996 at 74 years old in New York City after a surgery and complications from the polio. Her works hang in major museums from the Whitney to the Smithsonian. Her paintings can sometimes seem deceptively simple, but so can Mondrian's. There are years of looking and thinking behind these works. The abstraction is there in tension, in composition. But Gloucester is there too. Because, as Nell Blaine learned in France, the world is just too beautiful not to paint it. Sar Fedorsky lives on a short lane spotted with old quarries and neighbors' houses in the Lanesville Woods, the northernmost village of Gloucester, Massachusetts. In 2018, Sar received a Guggenheim Award for her series of photographs entitled The Light Under the Door, a collection of tense but ethereal black and white images shot in and around Sar's home. Much of Sar's work speaks to the tension between the beautiful familiarity of place and longing for someplace else. About The Light Under the Door, Sar says she wanted to create a photo narrative about a woman who dreams of a larger life. Comfortable at home, she also yearns to experience the broader world. At times, she feels alone. She seeks comfort in art, literature, and her imagination. Sar moved to Rockport as a child. She attended Rockport middle and high schools, but that journey reveals ambivalence, a belief that maybe she should be elsewhere. It's almost a surprise that Cape Ann is home.
Well, I was born in New Orleans, and my mom quickly divorced our father, so I never got to know him. And around the age of 4, we moved to Greenwich Village. And so even though I didn't spend that much time in New Orleans, I always feel like it's a part of me, and I've returned a lot, just kind of curious about all the places that we lived. And we were in the French Quarter. She was an artist, and she worked as a street painter on the, I think she did portraits and things like caricatures. And my father was actually very good with watercolor and did caricatures in watercolor in the moment, which was supposed to be really hard. So my mom was self-taught. So we moved to New York City, and that's where I spent about 10 years. I feel like those were a big portion of my childhood, especially living in an urban environment, Greenwich Village in the 60s. It was, really fantastic. And we came to Cape Ann during the summers. My mother she was born in Fitchburg and brought up in Fitchburg in the Depression era, and she just couldn't wait to get out. So she never really wanted to come back, but she thought, well, it was just hard being a single mom in New York City in the 70s. And we were coming here for the summers, and one year the New York City schools went on strike, and they just kept going on strike, and she decided to stay here, so we stayed. That's how we ended up moving here. Yeah, it was very, just one of those things, we just stayed.
After undergraduate studies at Amherst College, Sar intended to study international business and moved to Washington, D.C. She trained as a stockbroker, but before starting grad school, Sar visited San Francisco. There, she happened to walk into the doors of the Art Institute and serendipitously met photographer Jock Sturgis, famous for photographs of children and teenagers. That felicitous meeting swapped out Sar's business career for photography. After studying at the Academy of Art College in San Francisco, she returned to Massachusetts and worked as a photojournalist, freelancing for UPI, the Boston Globe, and even the Gloucester Times. But Sar's parents' artistic lives remained a sovereign message inside her. Around 2000, Sar joined a photography critique group led by Nubar Alexanian, an international photographer and journalist. The Boston Globe said of Alexanian's photos, "They are metaphors. Read them like a poem." Alexanian became then, and still is, an essential mentor for Sar. In 2012, she returned to school for an MFA. Sar shoots in black and white, saying this way the photographs shed realism for abstraction. She also enjoys printing zeotypes, an alternative print process that involves hand-coated paper and digital negatives. This allows her to produce unique prints with a handmade feel from digitally captured images. Sar left the literal messages of photojournalism for a different language, abstraction and emotion, almost 20 years ago. She says the Guggenheim Award affirmed this course, and that felt good. And it also affirmed for her that work made from home can matter.
The way I saw the Guggenheims, I really felt I had made a lot of the right decisions. Like, even though there was so many struggles, that was just a good, a nice stamp of approval. But it also confirmed, not that only just that all the hard work was paying off, but also that I was going in the right direction, because The Light Under the Door had just been published. And I really believed that the personal work, it seemed like, as much as I wanted to travel, it seemed like like you could make really a strong body of work within, even here, like my home, and within 200 yards of this house. So most of the images from The Light of the Door are photographed really close to the home.
The Guggenheim Award invited Saar to ask, could she make photographs away from her home in Gloucester? Could she create work someplace else that still held parts of her? She chose to travel to Oaxaca, Mexico. Saar is still editing this series entitled The Light Across the Border. She is still trying to understand what these images actually mean to her. Meanwhile, she is home again in Lanesville, shooting photographs of quarries in her neighborhood. These images seem to record the mark of infinity within a fractured second of time and space. Lessons in vastness, just steps from her Lanesville home.